Today, I'm going to be speaking with Suzanne Craig, who's an investigative reporter and author, along with Russ Buettner, of Lucky Loser: How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. Suzanne, I'm so glad to talk to you about this because there's really so many layers to this story. There's the layer of, if you accept Trump as the successful business person, we would ask the question, do successful business people make good presidents? But I don't even think we're there, because there's the question of, is Donald Trump actually a successful business person and or a self-made man? Many people now know that Trump is not a self-made man, that he inherited wealth and his business from his father, Fred. Well, maybe Fred was the self-made guy, but you talk about in the book how government programs, to a great degree, helped Fred build the wealth that Donald ultimately inherited. So can we start with Fred Trump?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. And I think, Fred, his father, had a bit of a leg up. The family had some money. His father died when he was young. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough money that it allowed him to start building single family homes. And it's sort of an incredible story. Fred was in his teens when his father passed away of the Spanish flu. And the mom there was really driving the bus. She wanted to start a business, and Fred dreamed of being a builder. So he started taking courses at the local Y and to learn the trade and started building these single family homes. And that he was very good at it. And that could have been his trajectory. But he met a time in American history where the government started putting together programs for people coming out of both the Depression and World War II. And Fred got in on those programs, and he expanded very quickly into building large-scale housing projects. You can still see some of them today in New York. Two of the big ones that come to mind are Beach Haven and Shore Haven. But he really made his money through those programs. And those programs were put together at a time. One could argue maybe in a rush. There was a lot of loopholes in them, and Fred made a lot of money exploiting those loopholes, and I think kind of pushing things to the edge. But that's how the family fortune, by and large, was made.
So Donald Trump has sometimes talked about how he got started with this small loan of $1 million, but that seems like a very incomplete sort of origin
Yeah.
story, really, isn't it?
I would say rather than incomplete, it's just wrong. And it's interesting because Russ and I got a hold of a lot of documents from Fred Trump's financial, life. Tens of thousands, more than 100,000 pages. And the closest we could come to identifying anything close to $1 million loan was a gift of $1 million he was given in the 1970s by Fred. But Donald, at every turn, there was a succession struggle in the family early on. Fred Trump Sr. has an heir, had an eldest son, a namesake who was supposed to be the heir. And early on, that didn't work out. Fred, his son, I think, was interested in the family business early on, according to friends that we spoke to in high school who knew him, but he had other interests. And Fred, his dad, was sort of having none of that and just saw a weakness there. And I think it ultimately destroyed Fred Jr. He died of alcoholism-related complications in his early 40s. It was quite tragic. But by the time Donald Trump was 18 or 19, that succession battle was over, and Fred Trump had picked his man, and it was Donald.
One of the claims that's been made, and superficially, I ran some numbers and it certainly seems plausible, is that had Donald Trump all along simply thrown his money, his family's
Yeah.
money, ultimately his money, into an S&P 500 index fund or a total stock market index fund, just let it ride, reinvest the dividends, et cetera,
Ugh.
that actually he'd be wealthier than he is today, bearing in mind we don't exactly know how
Right.
wealthy he is because there seems to be some doubts about it based on everything we've learned. Is that fair to say? Has he done worse by doing things with the money rather than just letting it ride in the market?
I think Russ and I feel there's no question he invested in himself, and it was a bad investment compared to just putting his money in the S&P 500, for example. Would it, yes, no question. Yeah.
And can you say anything more about to what degree that's the case, or what is that gap that mathematical gap that appears there based on your understanding of the amount of money he received and the times at which he received them?
Well, I think he if he just invested in the S&P 500, it would have been more than double what he has, not what he has now, but what he inherited. Not just inherited, but also the money that he got from The Apprentice. We talk about the book, and it's named Lucky Loser for a reason, because Donald Trump has had some incredible strokes of luck in his life. One of them was simply being born the son of Fred Trump, and into an incredibly wealthy family at the time. Fred would have been a billionaire by today's standards. And they lived a very privileged life. And he inherited more than $400 million ultimately when Fred died. And then there was also all the things he got, all the money that he got, sometimes that his other siblings didn't get during his lifetime. And then the second rush of money that he got was from The Apprentice, the TV show. And that one's sort of an interesting one, because I think when people try to get their head around how do you make so much money from a TV show, he made pretty much the equivalent of what he inherited from his father. It was because while he was a host of The Apprentice, and he got a $50,000 fee originally for doing that, he cut an incredibly lucrative deal with Mark Burnett, who was the producer of the show, and he had been coming off of Survivor. And Mark Burnett was starting to understand the power of integration, or product integration money. That's when you have a product on a show, and the company that produces that product, they pay to have their product on the show. And The Apprentice was essentially an hour, 45-minute long commercial for products. A toothpaste company would come on and they would have the contestants battle to make an ad campaign for them.
Right.
And we learned through financials that we obtained from the show that they were making every episode was making $1, $2, $3 million, $4 million. Donald Trump was getting half of that. And then in addition to that, he was striking licensing deals off of his celebrity. And he was making another, half of the money, about roughly, came from product integration, and another 200 some million came from the licensing deals that he struck. So these were the two huge rushes of money that he had in his life, these two fortunes. And what the book shows is that he invested them in businesses, in short, that largely lost money for one reason or another.
Can you talk a little bit about Trump's bankruptcies and specifically address Trump's claim, whenever he's been confronted with this, that his bankruptcies were all just knowing how to use or game the system? Much like when he gets called out for donating to Democrats in the past, he says, well, I was playing the game. I knew how you manage it. Similarly, that his bankruptcies were not failures in a business sense, but they were him understanding the law and understanding the benefits of calculated bankruptcy. Is that true?
There's simple things to break that down for his Atlantic City bankruptcies. This is a man who went into Atlantic City and built 3 casinos that were competing against each other. Is there any shock that they went bankrupt? They went bankrupt because of his bad decisions. I mean, that's the bottom line for those. I mean, when I hear that, I hear he's a master of the tax code, and that's why he has losses. We looked at this, it doesn't, there's some depreciation in the numbers that we saw, and we've seen his taxes for his corporate and personal taxes for, 20 some years, his modern taxes up to 2018. What we saw was actual losses in the businesses, which we had visibility into. There are a few that make money, but for the most part, by and large, they lose money, and they require a lot of money, just capital injections, to keep going.
I want to talk a little bit about the tax returns, because you were the reporter to whom Donald Trump's 95 tax returns, I believe, were anonymously mailed during the 2016 presidential election. And if I recall correctly, although sometimes our memory of this stuff gets hazy, the headlines were Trump's tax returns leaked and we're going to learn all this stuff. But then it turned out it was the 95 tax returns. Was it only 95 that was leaked to you?
No, so I'll walk you through that. The first returns that we got were the 1995 tax returns, and those showed cumulative losses of roughly $1 billion. It was a pretty shocking number. We were able to confirm that those were authentic, and we got them to press. But then as we went on, it's like this great thing about the wonder of journalism. You never quite know what you're going to be doing next when you come into the office the next day. We kept writing on his taxes and looking for stories. We kept getting more information. So we kept writing. And in 2017, we started to look into Fred Trump and just the wealth that was inherited. We wanted to break down exactly, who was Fred Trump and what did Donald inherit from that. And as part of that search to get to the bottom of that, we started just by looking at property records in New York City. There's this great system where you can look up the owners of properties. And in part of doing that, we saw some names that were on a lot of the documents. So we started to keep a source list. One of the people that we saw was occasionally would appear on it was Mary Trump and her brother Fred III. They all have similar names named after each other. And we realized, and we'd known that Mary Trump had been in litigation with the family over her grandfather's will. She was essentially, her and her brother were essentially cut out. They weren't left very much, and they felt that they should have received a share equal to Donald and his siblings. So they went, and there was a lawsuit that went into litigation, and that's sort of a magic word for reporters. We knew that a lot of information, a lot of financial information had likely been turned over. We didn't know what, but I went to Mary Trump's store and I spoke to her. And initially she wasn't receptive, but eventually we met. And she didn't really know either what was in those documents, but she agreed to go and get them for us. And we took them and we took them to a locked room in the New York Times, and spent about a year going through them. And that story had some tax return information, more about Fred Trump. We had some partnership information. We had his gift tax returns back to the 1940s. But we were able to ascertain through that story, both that Donald Trump inherited, this $400 million plus money, but that it was enhanced through tax fraud. And there we saw something quite fascinating, which was, Fred Trump, there's a lot of differences between Fred and Donald. In some ways they're similar, but one of the differences is Fred Trump kept so much cash on hand. And in the early 1990s, he was getting on in age. And the kids realized that if he died, they'd be facing a 50% roughly gift tax on that cash. So they set up this corporation. And what they did is Fred Trump, he bought a lot of stuff for his buildings. You think boilers and paint and, things big and small. And he would go and buy them from wholesalers. Well, one day all of that switched and another company started buying it. It was a company controlled by Donald Trump and his siblings. What they would do is they would buy it. They would sell it to their dad at a markup and pocket the difference. The only purpose of that company was to do that and drain the cash down from Fred Trump so that they could get a hold of it to avoid that higher tax. So that story ran.
Yeah.
And then eventually we kept digging around. We got another sort of, I guess, a transcript of tax return information from 1985 to 1994, if I'm remembering that correctly. And that showed another decade where he lost just hundreds of millions of dollars, including even the year he wrote Art of the Deal, which was, he's claiming to be this big deal maker and a huge success. And in fact, that year, he's lost tens of millions of dollars on his tax return. And then the final piece of it was we ended up eventually getting his tax return information for a few decades, both personal and corporate, up to 2018. We were able to get that before even the Supreme Court ruled on it, and show readers that he doesn't pay a lot of income tax, that he's had huge losses, but also we were able to reveal a lot about, just the magnitude of money that he made from The Apprentice, which has papered over the losses on a lot of his other businesses.
Last thing I want to talk about is more recently Trump's income and businesses. From the outside, it seems as though, number one, Trump has very high fixed costs by nature with the plane and the various homes. And there just seems to be a lot of overhead there, which maybe generates the need for Trump to do things like selling a commemorative coin just 5.5 weeks out from a presidential election, which, you don't typically see presidential candidates do. So maybe there's like a high fixed cost and a need for cash there. But then also there's been this reporting that while he was president, he made $1.6 billion, about $400 million a year. What is that income from? Is it rents on buildings he owns, licensing fees for buildings his name's on, but he doesn't know? Like, what is his current income from?
Yeah, and I can't speak necessarily to that number. It may be revenue, but what he has been able to do recently, and I'm not sure it makes up for, we saw coming into him running for president that his licensing deals, not surprisingly, were on the downtick. He was, several years into Celebrity Apprentice. His brand was not as red hot as it was when The Apprentice first took off. And then when he came down the escalator that day to announce that he was running for president, he made disparaging comments about Mexicans. And a lot of the licensing deals just went for the door, and NBC also fired him. And then during the presidency, he definitely was able to profit off of it in certain ways. I use that word carefully because a lot of the ways that he was able to make money, the old post office comes to mind. It's the hotel that he was operating in Washington. People would come and stay there.
Yeah.
Foreign governments would buy rooms. All that did was just sort of mitigate his losses. He lost a lot of money on the old post office. We can see that through his taxes and also from information that has been released on the hotel. And he was also pumping a lot of money into it. But that money that was going in from insiders trying to curry favor definitely curbed his losses. And he also, at Mar-a-Lago, he also raised the price of entrance for people wanting a membership, so that helped. But right now, he's really in an interesting situation. He's no longer a hospitality brand. He's a political brand. I talked to experts during the book writing process about that, and many of them, these hospitality consultants who track brand, they're not following him anymore. He's gone into things like you mentioned, the coins. He's got sneakers going. He's done a Bible. These are licensing deals, and they're bringing in some money. I just don't see them sort of outweighing what he was bringing in. And then he's got True Social. That's tricky. That's the publicly traded company. I don't know what it's trading at today, but if he were to sell whatever interest he has there, it would kill the stock. So that's a tricky situation. And then remember the headwinds that he's facing if he's forced to pay the fines in New York State. And just talk about the New York Attorney General there. He had a judgment against him. The fines are, in the 450 million range. And if that case is upheld on appeal, he's going to have to write a check for that. So there's a lot of headwinds coming in, and we don't know where this is going to end. A lot of it depends if he's elected or if he's not.
Yes, very much seems to be riding on that for sure.
Yeah.
We've been speaking with Suzanne Craig, who, alongside Russ Buettner, is co-author of Lucky Loser, How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. Suzanne, so great having you on. Yeah. I really appreciate it.
Dave, this was really great. Thanks for having me on to chat about it. We're excited about the book.